And we are live. This is SITREP PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interests. I'm Ivan at home, coming to you live from the great city of Manila. With me is my co-host, Inform PH, Alex. Hello.
Yes.
So as
Hello,
tensions
guys.
as tensions continue in the West Philippine Sea over maritime disputes between the Philippines and China, and attention is now being focused on increasing American involvement to aid its Southeast Asian neighbor, the role of our other neighbors in the region can oftentimes be forgotten.
Yes, the countries of ASEAN like Malaysia, Singapore, and other emerging Pacific middle powers like Australia and New Zealand can be overlooked if we view it in the disputes in the South China Sea in a purely US versus China binary issue. These are very diverse places with different political and security interests. So, to help us introduce us more to our neighbors and the role they have to play in this new great powers game brewing in our own backyard, we have Professor James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. He deals with governance issues in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. And he is currently uh, the Vice President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Tasmania branch. Professor Chin, welcome to SITREP.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir. How's the weather over there in Tasmania? Before we start, we heard you had the second coldest night on record recently.
Yes, Tasmania traditionally is the coldest part of Australia. So as we speak, the temperature outside is about 3 degrees.
Don't you miss, the Southeast Asian weather whilst you're there? So perhaps before we really get down to the issues, perhaps you can tell us a bit about yourself, sir, and how did you get started on your field of work, what you do, and what really interests you.
Sure. As your kind introduction states, I'm currently a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, but I grew up in Malaysia, so I'm still a Malaysian, and I've lived in Australia for about 10 years. So my field of studies is basically political development in Southeast Asia. I tend to specialize on Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. But I also deal a bit with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand.
Thank you, sir. So whilst we start that off, unless Alex has another question. So
Yes, Professor, to start off with our podcast, this is the first question. So, what are the key factors driving Malaysia's foreign policy decisions regarding China? And in your opinion, how have these evolved over the past decade? How does Malaysia balance its economic and strategic interests with China against its security concerns in the South China Sea?
Sure. So I think the starting point for understanding how the Malaysian elite see China is to understand that the Malaysian elites do not see China as a threat. They see China as both a threat and an opportunity. You have to remember, for many of the elites in the region, and I include the Philippines, they always understood that China has always been a great power in this part of the world. Other than the 300 odd years of Western colonization,
yes.
China has always played a very important role in Southeast Asia. So for them, if you look at the Malaysian attitude towards China, you can sort of divide it into three different periods. The first period is immediately the Cold War period after the Second World War, when China became communist in 1949. There was quite a strong communist movement in Malaysia. In fact, an armed communist insurgency in Malaysia. So that colored the elite's attitude towards China. And the British, of course, were helping the newly independent Malaysia to fight the communists. So that sort of dragged on until the opening up of China in the 1980s. The situation became more normalized after 1989 when the Communist Party of Malaya signed a peace agreement with the Malaysian government, and the Chinese government made it very clear that they no longer support communist insurgency in the region. Then the second period is, of course, the economic opening up of China. China became sort of a very fast-growing economy, and Malaysia was quite uniquely positioned to sort of take benefits from that. Because, as you know, a large chunk of the Malaysian population, more than 20%, are actually ethnic Chinese. So a lot of them started to move into China to expand trade. The third phase is the current phase that we're living through, and you can argue that that probably came in the 2000s when China became very strong, sort of on the way to become the world's number one economy. So the last 10 or 15 years, the number one trading partner for Malaysia has been China. And of course, in recent years, you also have to, balance that with the rising tensions in the South China Sea. So in some ways, Malaysian attitude towards China, like I said, is both a threat and an opportunity, mostly economic opportunity. But in terms of threat, Malaysia has some outstanding territorial antagonism with China over several islands in the South China Sea. I think one very important point that a lot of analysts have missed out is that from Beijing's point of view, Malaysia is probably the most important country in terms of the conflict in the South China Sea, for the very simple reason that Malaysia is the only country in ASEAN that straddles both sides of the South China Sea. People keep forgetting that part of Malaysia is the states of Sabah and Sarawak, and they're actually located on the island of Borneo. So if you were to draw a circle, what the Chinese call the 9-dash line, if you were to draw a circle in the South China Sea, the only country that straddles both sides of the South China Sea is Malaysia. So in other words, if you're a strategic planner sitting in Beijing, you can see anytime there's some sort of a crisis, tension in the South China Sea, Malaysia will be affected. So for that reason, in some ways, Beijing sees Malaysia as a very, very important country. The other reason why Malaysia is probably very important to China, not only in terms of trade, is that the signature policy of President Xi Jinping is a thing called BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the first plan, version 1.0, is very clear that for Southeast Asia, the big thing for the BRI is high-speed train that starts from Singapore and it goes all the way up to Kunming, the capital city of the Yunnan province in southern China. So the high-speed train, 1/3 of it will have to pass through the Malay Peninsula. So really, Malaysia plays a very crucial role in terms of the China-Southeast Asian relationship.
So building on the Malaysian angle, recently Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has made headlines for his recent comments on China, and Prime Minister Anwar insisted that Malaysians do not have a problem with China, and that though Malaysia remains friendly to Western countries such as the United States and Australia, these countries should not impose their issues on China and preclude us from a friendly relationship with Beijing. And so, from a lot of us here in Manila, especially several of the foreign policy experts here in Manila, we're seeing a lot of, a perceived reproach to China from Kuala Lumpur. And this adds to further disconcern among many foreign policy experts here on whether the Philippines is alone in asserting its navigation and international rights here in our backyard, and whether other ASEAN countries are not as very as sympathetic and as cooperative or as united behind that. So basically, my question is, how is Malaysia balancing its security interests, specifically its own disputed waters with the PRC? How does it balance that with its with its economic interests with Beijing? And can you explain Anwar Ibrahim's recent rhetorics and where is that coming from?
So I think the starting point to understand is, as I said earlier, Malaysia sees China is both a threat and an opportunity. Opportunity, of
Yes.
course, is in terms of economic opportunities. And I think for a long time, if you look at the Philippines, it's the same situation. The Filipinos see China as both an opportunity and a threat as well. But I think the important thing to remember is that if you want to deal with China, the most obvious or the ideal situation will be that for ASEAN to take a collective stand, especially on the South China Sea issue. But Beijing has quite cleverly said that they will not deal in terms of territorial disputes. They will not deal with ASEAN collectively, so they only want to deal bilaterally. I think most countries in ASEAN would prefer not to confront China because they know over the long term China is much, much stronger than them. So they're always hedging their bets. They want one leg in the Western camp and they want another leg on the so-called Eastern camp. So they want to be neutral. In the IR literature, they said that they want to be friends to all. So I think that is the situation that we're facing. I think the situation with the Philippines, I think this is a fairly new situation, especially in terms of the confrontation. If you look at what Philippines have done in the last many, many years, a lot of the confrontation was sort of pushed to the side. Malaysia actually has lots of confrontation with the PLA army or the navy. They call it the what they call it border navy in Chinese terms. But Malaysia actually has quite a number of run-in with this Chinese navy, especially at a place called James Shore off the coast of Bintulu. But the Malaysian attitude is that we do not want to play out, we do not want to go to the press, we do not want to make a big deal of it.
Yes.
We'll just try to deal with China behind the scenes through diplomatic notes. So I think the way to answer your question is that Malaysia is trying to play both sides. They try to be as neutral as possible, but I think the Malaysian elites understand that this situation will not last forever. So they're hoping that in the future, when China really is the number one power around the world, China will accept the fact that we live in a multilateral world and that the rules of the international arena is very important. That the best way to maintain stability is that if everybody follow the rules.
Mhm.
So that is the reason why, if you look at ASEAN collectively, even though they come to a sort of agreement on the South China Sea, they keep emphasizing two things. The first thing is that they talk about the rule of law in the international arena. Secondly, ASEAN always talks about ASEAN centrality. So in other words, they're trying to pull the Chinese into negotiating collectively. Now, whether this will succeed or not is still up for debate. Because we know that the Chinese are very close to countries like Cambodia and Myanmar. These are the two newer countries, ASEAN. So they have been asserting, sort of pro-Beijing views. But we also know that China doesn't really want outright confrontation as well. Part of it has got to do with the fact that China is currently in an economic war with America, and I don't think they want a hot war in Southeast Asia.
So you mentioned ASEAN, sir, and that's where we go to our next question, because you write a lot about ASEAN in your published works, and the decisions from the different regional capitals in the bloc. And so maybe you can give us a brief overview on the state of things, on the different interests and the different security concerns from the countries that are our neighbors. And as we enter into the second half of 2024, specifically with regards to the South China Sea, because there are many competing claims there. And maybe you can build on, is ASEAN centrality still a thing? Or is it like what another professor we interviewed, Professor Colin Koh from Singapore, said, ASEAN centrality and United ASEAN Front is simply a rhetoric that's used in research conference rooms and isn't really a thing?
So in terms of ASEAN centrality, ASEAN has been using that term for many, many years. The problem, as I said earlier, is that China refuses to deal with the South China Sea issue with ASEAN collectively. They said they're only willing to talk to countries where they have overlapping claims. The problem with ASEAN nowadays is that there seems to be a divide between the 5 original members of ASEAN and the 5 new members. Because as I said earlier, everybody understands that the Chinese have a lot of influence with countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, and probably Laos. The other problem is that ASEAN is now sort of a leaderless in the sense that previously ASEAN's leadership was always understood to be held by the Indonesians, the largest country and probably the most important country, ASEAN. Indonesia has sort of not taken the lead on the South China Sea issue. There are many reasons for that, but if you speak to ASEAN people, most people will say that Indonesia is probably not taking a lead on ASEAN issues because Indonesia in the last few years has become a member of the G20, so it's playing in the big boys club. So that probably accounts for the fact that countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and probably Philippines over the long run has also looked for other organizations to join. Malaysia has already joined RCEP, and they're probably in the process of applying for membership of a BRICS, BRICS. So everybody understands that although ASEAN is really, really important, the problem is that you got all these other organizations coming out overlapping interest in ASEAN. But I think it's really, really important when you deal with issues like South China Sea, you need to draw a line between economic issues and the military aspects. The military aspects is the one that people like me are more worried about, simply because China's Navy has a blue ocean ability now. They're in the process of building several aircraft carriers. Two are actually online. They're in the process of building another 8 aircraft carrier. So very soon, over the next 10 years, they will really have, sort of a military advantage over the South China Sea. And that also accounts for the fact that even among the West, they can see this clearly, and that's the reason why the West have come up with a thing called AUKUS, sort of to counterbalance the Chinese interest in South China Sea.
Very interesting points, Professor James. So we have one question from the commenter, from a commenter. So the question is Malaysia not as confrontational with China because you were already able to drill the oil in your part of the sea with the help of the Americans, just like how Indonesia did it? So that is a question from the comment section.
Sure. I don't think that is the main reason. The main reason is that at the end of the day, the Malaysian foreign policy circle has quite a persuasive argument. If you go for full confrontation with China over South China Sea, it is a win and lose proposition. Malaysia will probably be on the losing side, simply because China can use the threat aspect to shut you down. And like I said, over the next 10 years, it's very clear that they will have a military advantage as well. So it'll be a lose-lose proposition for the Malaysians. Their attitude is that if you look history over the long term, Southeast Asia has always been under the Chinese shadow before colonization, Western colonization. And in those days, they can deal with China. So there's no reason why going forward, you cannot find a way to live with China. In some ways, this is the old saying that, you can't pick your neighbor. You can only deal with your neighbor.
Okay, so interesting point. So moving on to Australia, where you currently are at, sir, there's an increasing importance being placed on Australia's role in the Western Alliance and its role in the region as a whole. So the AUKUS security partnership is the most prime recent example of this. Perhaps explain to our listeners what is the AUKUS security partnership and how does it affect Australia's relationship with the region, and what is Australia trying to achieve in the ASEAN with this?
So Australia's interest, to understand Australia's interest, you have to understand America's interest. Because in the foreign policy circle, most people will regard Australia as sort of a deputy sheriff to America. And this is a very widely held view in ASEAN foreign policy circles. I think if you look carefully at AUKUS thing, is basically to enhance Australia's military ability. But the problem with AUKUS is that everybody understands that it's being used to counter China. and that is both a positive and a negative. My understanding is that the AUKUS thing will take many years to build, maybe 10 to 15 years before Australia will come to full capability under the so-called nuclear technology transfer program. I think what Australia wants is very similar to what America wants. Australia wants to make sure that Southeast Asia, especially South China Sea, has sort of free navigation to everybody. Anybody who wants to sail through South China Sea will not face complications from the Chinese. I think it's very important for your listeners to understand that Southeast Asia, South China Sea, and the Straits of Malacca are really crucial in terms of the world trade. Very simple example of that is that anything that goes to Europe or anything that goes to India, which is an emerging power, have to go through Straits of Malacca and South China Sea to reach the destination in East Asia. And I'm counting Taiwan, economies of Taiwan, Japan, and China. You really, as Korea as well, you really can't run away from the South China Sea. So that's the reason why people spend a lot of the time and energy and resources trying to understand and avoid a conflict in the South China Sea. But my take is that the Chinese are quite rational in the approach. Yes, they're going to push for the 9-line thing. And I think in the case of the Philippines, I think the reason why the Chinese are especially pissed off with the Philippines is because the Philippines took this case to the international arbitration in The Hague. So I think that's the one. So if you look at the Chinese behavior before that step, you can see that the Philippines and Malaysia are quite similar. They will try to have, both a hot and cold relationship with China. They were neither in the Chinese camp, neither were they openly in the Western camp. So that's the reason why I say it's very important that people understand the issue, split in two issues. One is essentially trade. The other is a military one. The other thing I need to mention, and I think not many people in the Philippines understand, is that there's actually a security alliances among the Western country, Australia, New Zealand, UK, with Malaysia and Singapore under the Five Powers Defense Pact. And many people in the Philippines and in Thailand, all the other countries are not aware of this pact. So there's already a military pact in terms of the South China Sea from the Malaysian-Singapore angle. And the Philippines have a long-standing, military pact with the Americans as well. So so that's the reason why I said the military side can sort of be argued on its own. But if you try to bring the trade, everything lumped together, then it becomes very, very complicated.
Can I just ask a brief follow-up question? You mentioned that the Chinese got incredibly angry when we brought it up to arbitration. Did it throw a wrench into their, into their plans, or did it cause some sort of did it make them reimagine or replan a lot of their decision making? What's the consequences of the arbitration ruling, sir?
So the consequences for the Chinese is not so much that they change the long-term plans. Their long-term plan is still to dominate the world in economic terms. They see Southeast Asia like the way the Americans see Central America and South America. They see Southeast Asia as part of their backyard. So if you look at China traditionally, right, you can see that China is sort of surrounded. To the north, previously, they had very bad relations with the Soviet Union. On the eastern side, they have bad relations with Korea and Japan. And on the southern flank, they got bad relations with India. So they never had big problem with Southeast Asia. So that's the reason why they spend so much attention to Southeast Asia. So you have to look at it from the Chinese perspective. It's very important that they sort of dominate Southeast Asia. So that's one point. The second point I think is really important is that over the long term, they understand that the economy and technology will really be the key points in terms of international relations, who has more influence around the world. Now, in the case of the international arbitration, the question you asked, has it changed anything for the Chinese? The Chinese are especially angry because now you have a legal case where the international arbitration has ruled that the 9-line thing is actually not real. And this cuts into the Chinese narrative that the 9-line is actually a real thing. If you read the judgment in full, you'll find that it is very clear that most of the judges do not believe that the 9-line is actually grounded in real history. It is sort of an invented history from the side of the Chinese. And I think that is the thing that China is really angry about. Because right, among the Chinese themselves, one of the great beliefs of the Chinese nation is that they are one of the world's oldest civilization. I mean, there
Yes.
are people in China today who even believes that, Columbus did not find America. It was the Chinese who founded America.
So in a way, you're saying that China's long-term goal here is to enforce some sort of Monroe Doctrine style Big Brother of Asia dynamic.
Not Monroe Doctrine exactly, because the Monroe Doctrine was grounded in military. What they call, they
Yes.
use the military to enforce it. In the case of the Chinese going forward, they understand that in today's world, I think the military thing is the last option. The first option is of course technology and your economy. And it's quite clear that, even with Philippines, if you look at the last 10 years, China is your number one trading partner. So in some ways, like I said, Southeast Asia, you can't run away from the Chinese shadow. You just have to come to what they call, the rules of the game. If you can set the right rules, everybody follow the rules, then everybody can live quite happily with each other.
Okay, so moving back to Australia, sir. Australia vows recently, Australia and the Philippines vowed a renewed strategic relationship. And Anthony Albanese visited Manila last year, and President Marcos was given the honor of speaking to the Australian Parliament. And both talked about intensifying their security cooperation. You recently have Australian ships engaged in joint patrols with other Western allies in disputed waters in the West Philippine Sea. And there's also moves right now to have status of forces agreements with Australian troops potentially rotating around the Philippines. What basically our question here, sir, is what's Australia's intent over here with these moves? What's the role that the Philippines plays in Australian foreign policy, and what does Canberra hope to achieve from these approaches to the Philippines?
Sure, of course, I can't speak for Canberra, but my guess would be, the Australians are simply follow the Americans. The Americans are trying to engage the Chinese, and everybody understands that the Americans are trying to build a new military alliance, starting from South Korea, extending to Japan, extending to Taiwan, and extending to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. So the Americans are trying to build a chain around China. Not so much to check the Chinese, but to make sure that the Chinese don't misbehave too badly. And I think the increased military cooperation between Philippines and Australia is part of this overall strategy to make sure there's more engagement for Western military to be in Southeast Asia. Because you see the same thing as well. Australia is getting more active. Like I say, on top of AUKUS, they're actually doing more military maneuvers and exercises with other countries as well. So, for example, people forget that, America was actually Vietnam's enemy up to the 1970s. And yet, very recently, the Vietnamese have taken part in military exercise with the Americans. So everybody understands that, as you have more players in the region, then it makes it so much harder for the Chinese to dominate the region militarily.
So we go next to Alex. Alex, do you have questions ready? Okay, I guess my co-host is having technical difficulties. So, focusing still on the Philippines and the Philippine defense issues, sir. We want to get to your reactions because we're hearing today word from the Armed Forces of the Philippines that they're giving the green light to Filipino soldiers to actively engage and repel with force if necessary the Chinese PLAN if they were to try to illegally board Philippine public vessels again. Perhaps we can get your reactions on this and, ongoing escalations in the West Philippine Sea. How will other countries view this, and do you think it will lead anywhere? The fact that Manila has now given a green light to our sailors not to just simply hand our weapons to them, but to engage in fisticuffs if necessary.
Sure. So I think the Philippines have sort of escalated the situation, pushing it up a few knots. My take on the situation is that if something were to blow up, it will be contained. I don't think the West at the present moment, and other countries in ASEAN are ready for a huge escalation. So if the Philippines did issue this order, it may be a situation where you might have some small firefights, but I don't think it will lead to a major escalation.
All right, it won't lead to a major escalation. And lastly, sir, you
Mhm.
you how do you expect the state of, of the region to be in the next few years? Do you expect tensions in the South China Sea to further flare up? And how will ASEAN countries react to an increasingly assertive and, at least from Manila's perspective, an increasingly aggressive China and the West's effort to contain it? What's your outlook for the next half decade or decade?
Sure, I think the outlook is very similar to what a lot of other people have said. I think we can expect more escalation, but I don't think the major powers will allow it to escalate to become a big issue. There'll be a lot of small skirmishes, and I think what will happen is that ASEAN sooner or later will have to decide whether it wants to come together collectively as a group and talk to China about South China Sea, or they will allow China to manipulate ASEAN. At the present moment, I think it is very unlikely that ASEAN can come together collectively. We have seen ASEAN has been quite a failure, even on issues like trying to stop the war in Myanmar. They can't seem to get act together. So since they can't even get act together on a small issue like Myanmar, I doubt very much that they can get act together confronting China collectively.
So
I also
yeah,
sorry.
it would need to be bilateral negotiations now between, like-minded ASEAN states rather than a collective group. So is that what you're
That's
saying?
right. Yes, the problem with the bilateral approach is that China is so much bigger. So China can bully you if you do it bilaterally. So that's the reason why a lot of middle powers are joining a lot of international organizations where China play a major role, right? RCEP, BRIC. The idea is that the more China are locking with your relationship into multiple international organizations, the harder it is for China to bully you. So the idea is to find plenty of platforms to deal with China. So things like the Shangri-La Security Dialogue will become very important. But having said that, like I said, the two flashpoints in Asia will not change. North Korea and South China Sea will not change. The big question that everybody is asking and nobody has a clear answer is that what will China do with the rise of India? That is a far more interesting question. It is quite clear that India will play a major role over the next 10 years, and nobody have an answer about what to do with India. It is also very clear that Russia is a diminished power. No matter what is the outcome of Ukraine, Russia will no longer play a major role.
And to end on a lighter note, sir, my producer's asking to perhaps close it off with, for us to get to know more about Malaysia. If a Filipino tourist were to go to and visit Malaysia today, where do you recommend they go, and what do you recommend they eat? What's your favorite Malaysian food for tourists, sir?
So the Malaysian food is very similar to Filipino food. The only major thing with the Malaysian food versus the Filipino food is that the Malaysian food, especially among the Malay, the Muslim community, they don't have pork. So things like lechong can be found
Yes.
widely. The Malaysian Chinese, they have lots of pork. But Malaysian, Filipino tourists traveling to Malaysia will find that everything is very similar. Even some of the words in Tagalog are very similar as
Yes.
well. So I think when we talk about Malaysia and the Philippines directly, Filipinos have been in Malaysia for a very long time. So for example, we know that 20% of the population in the state of Sabah are actually from the southern Philippines. They actually salute from Mindanao. And also, there's also always been a high number of intermarriages between Malaysians and Filipinos. So I don't think there's any surprises. I think what is less known is that the Malaysians have less knowledge about the Philippines compared to Filipinos' knowledge of Malaysia. But both countries are actually very similar. I used to go to Manila very often. I've always enjoyed my time in Manila. But for Filipinos, I think when they go to Kuala Lumpur, I think one of the things that will very surprise them is that costs are fairly similar. Because a
Right.
lot of Filipinos, they complain going to places like Singapore, things are a lot more expensive. They think that it's the same in Malaysia, when in fact the cost in Malaysia and Manila is about the same.
So, Professor James Chin, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us here on SITREP PH and for your great interest in regional politics and on Philippine affairs. Do you want to plug any of your work or your social media accounts? Where can people find you? And is anything important coming up?
Sure. So in terms of my social media account, I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, and my Twitter name is James Chin 110. All my publications can be found on ResearchGate. You just have to Google my name under ResearchGate, and you should be able to see all my publications. Since you guys are already interested in Malaysia and China, I've actually just published an article about Malaysia and China in terms of foreign policy, and they came out in the Georgetown Journal. It came out last year, and that's available on ResearchGate if you're interested.
And thank you for that, Professor James. And this has been SITREP PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interest. This is Inform PH and Ivan at Home hosting. Be sure to follow our social media for updates on our upcoming podcasts. And we are follow this at SITREP PH on X and on YouTube. You can also like us on Facebook. We are on facebook.com/SITREPPH. Thank you and good night. Mabuhay.